The line drawing of this little chap that's on the screen is what you chose, Linda, to turn into your embroidery design. And in some ways, this kind of artwork, it's not the easiest to create embroidery designs from, because as soon as we get into anything bigger than 2 inches by 2 inches or 5 by 5 centimeters square, we then have to start looking at how we're going to use our stitches and our stitch angles and all our effects to try and create some visual interest, because the actual artwork doesn't give us a great deal to work with. But even so, you managed it, because this is the little dude that you managed to create. And even in the photograph you can see the different stitches and the way in which you've used those effects with the Florentine. You also tried out the padded satin on his claws and on his beak and on that little red heart. But all in all, you've also used the colour as well, and I love how you've done that tie, because I happen to know that in the design that's actually just one single colour. So I'm intrigued now, because did you keep stopping the machine and changing the colours as it was making that fill up the tie? Or have you used some kind of variegated embroidery thread or some sort of space dyed kind of embroidery thread to achieve that effect? Well, however you did it, bringing in that extra colour really makes a difference to this design, and that extra contrast and visual interest that it brings in makes it pop. Anyway, you used cotton, cutaway stabilizer, a number 11 needle after digitizing the design in Janome version 5, and in fact this stitch out is your second stitch out, because on your first you decided that there was too much puckering and you went back and you did some revisions to the digitized file and you chose to actually slacken off some of the densities. So I can understand your frustration when you've actually come back to it this second time and you find that there's still some puckering. And I've looked at your design and I've got a couple of ideas of some things that we might be able to do that you can consider as to why it's happening and what we can try and do to combat some of that going on. And then the other thing also that you mentioned in there is first time go around with padded satin, and you ran into a couple of issues with those, and we can look at that. But overall I think it's a fair attempt, it really is, and congratulations for actually tackling head on, putting on a full fill on these large areas, because I understand, you know, you find controlling the push and pull factors can be challenging. It's no secret, I think we all find them challenging, to be honest. So I'm glad that you actually did send it in, and you know, certainly from when you assessed your own work in your note, you concluded that you did a good job with the pathing, and that's absolutely right, you did a great job in fact, because not only did you use travel lines between objects when you could, but you also passed all your jumps. And what I mean by that is that you made your design as machine friendly as you possibly could, because where you could, you kept the jumps to the shortest distance that you possibly could, but also you made sure that there was some sort of a logical order as you were moving around the design, so that you weren't hopping backwards and forwards, repeating yourself. So for example, when you look at a detail like this, and you know that you're going to have to jump from here to here, and then you've got another detail to put in these parts, what you did was you stitched the white of the eye, hopped across, stitched the next white of the eye, and then did the black, came back, did the black, did the white and the white. All too often, if we're not careful, we tend to do the white, then this one, then we come back and put the next piece of detail in, then this one, then we go back and we do this, and it's not necessary. Clever pathing, even pathing jumps, will tell you, if you're over here, then do this one and then come back and alternate, and we can do that in the resequence bar, and I suspect that's exactly what you did. Great job on the pathing. And this is the design as you digitized it. Now, I didn't know what machine you stitched it out on, so for the purposes of this feedback, I've put it onto my digitizer as using the 140 by 140 hoop for my 15,000, and that's because your design is actually 8.5 centimeters by 13 centimeters, so he's not small by any means. And that in itself adds to the challenge of this push-pull compensation that we're going to take a look at. And of course, one of the factors that we've got to consider what sets that up is the type of stitch that you used, and also the effects that you applied to it. And we can see quite clearly here that we've got some different tatamis and that we've got some different effects. So there's one pattern here, and a different one here, both of which have got Florentine but in different directions. And then we've got another tatami here, and that's got a radial fill effect on it. Then of course we've got the satin on the eyes, or I think it's satin on the eyes, I'll need to remember that one. Certainly padded satin on the nose here, the heart and the claws. And then of course we've got another tatami pattern here, a different one on the neck here, and of course different stitch angles have helped as well. You've not used effects on all of them. And finally another one here on the feet. And of course the point is with this that as soon as we get these large areas where we are getting big patches where the stitch direction doesn't change much, then we know that we're going to be in for a little bit of a battle with this push and pull. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you back to the photograph where I will highlight some of the stitch angles and show you perhaps how that has created some of the puckering that you experience. And the first little bit that we're going to look at is this bit here at the top of his head. So we'll look at that object here, and it's here. I'm just going to take it into digitizing view rather than true view, and I'm actually going to bring it up on the screen here to 200, just magnify it a little. Okay, and I'm going to go to object properties so that you can see where you've put this Florentine on it. So it's going here, and in fact that means when it's stitching it's pretty much going horizontal from one side to the other, but of course you've got this curve on it as well. Now hold that thought, and of course going over to the photograph now, in effect what's happening is, if you imagine that that's the Florentine curve that you've put on there, and you're going from one side to the other, and then you have this open expanse here of fabric, which is where you've got the puckering. What's happening is that the fabric is being pulled on this side when it's traveling this way, and it's going in when it's going on that side there. Because when you get a curve like this, because bobbin thread and embroidery thread is happiest when it's going straight, it's going to try and pull itself straight. And of course, even though you might not be stitching at a vastly fast speed, they still go pretty quickly, and there's this little bit of stretch in there. And so what happens is, when it can, it tries to pull to the middle. And the deeper that you make this curve, the more that wants to pull across. The other thing that you need to think about when we're dealing with this kind of stitch and this kind of effect is, when we have that stitch direction, then not only is it pulling in this way because of the curve, it's also pulling in there if we have very long stitches. So the longer the stitch, the more opportunity there is to get that little bit of extra stretch on there. So there's always a bit of a balancing act between what stitch length you choose and also how deep the curve is. And there's a little trick to this as well, to remember that if you've got your curve coming this way, then it will always try and pull in along what would be that flat edge. So you can very quickly work out when you put Florentine onto a design where you're likely to get this kind of puckering. So of course on this one here we've got a little bit of puckering here, and when we go back to the design we'll be able to see the direction of that Florentine curve on there, that wave curve has pulled it in. So in other words, it's pulling in this way and it's pulling in this way because of the way in which it's going up and down and stitching here. This is basically a mirror image of the same. And we have it here. This one's a great big long wing here with this lovely great big curve on it, and of course you've got the puckering on this side, and in fact this is where your puckers are here on this one, as it's done a really good job of pulling this up nice and tight for you. And of course what it's trying to do is pinch itself in on the vertical. And of course you've got some more Florentine down here on the body, and there'll be a little bit of tension that's been sat up in the fabric there as well. But of course these curves, they're not the whole story, because I know that you're going to say, but I've got puckering on the ends of these feet. You've not got a huge amount on the ends of those feet, but yes, it is there. And in fact one of the reasons that you could think about this is that not only have you had your curve going this way, which has set up perhaps a little bit of rippling before you've laid down this, these stitches here are running across the bias. They're going backwards and forwards, and perhaps looking at some of the stitch length on that, not just the density. It's not so much the density, this is about stitch length and the angle of the stitches, bearing in mind that probably the puckering under here is more likely to be set up by that Florentine curve that you've got on there. Now, having explored some of the things that are actually physically happening as to what is actually causing this puckering, it's not a case of, well, let's not use Florentine and let's not use these stitch angles and let's not use these fills. That's not allowed. That's not part of the game. What we have to do is say, right, well, okay, how can we actually minimize it happening? What are the things that we can look at? And of course, there are always the basics. One obviously is secure hooping. And another one also is well, let's choose the right stabilizer. And oddly enough, one of the stabilizer problems that people do is they use stabilizer that is too thick for the fabric or too thick for the design, in the hope that a thicker, stiffer stabilizer will do the job. But actually sometimes it can make things worse. And think about it, if you've got sort of a thick stabilizer or a couple of layers of stabilizer, and whilst you're trying to keep everything flat and straight, of course what's happening is your thread is still stitching the same little short stitch, but your thread tension on your machine is going to be pulling that thread up even tighter. And again, it's this balancing act, isn't it, about finding the appropriate stabilizer that is no heavier and no thicker than it actually needs to be for the fabric that you're using, but it's still got to do its job of helping stabilize the grain of the fabric given the amount of stitches that you're going to put into it. So just for the sake of this exercise, let's assume that you had the right stabilizer on and it wasn't too thick, and also that your hooping was very good, that there was no shifting and that it was a nice, clean and secure hooping, that whilst you were stitching out this large design with lots and lots of stitches in it, there was no shifting. So that leaves us with a couple of options that we can deal with the digitizing, which is underlay and something else that's worth considering, which is called layering. So we'll go back to the design and take a look at underlays first. So the first object that we'll look at is that wing where there was the puckering on the edge, and if you recall, this is down the side of the body and the puckering was all here, as the Florentine and the way in which the stitching had done was actually trying to pull itself tighter into the middle vertically. So we'll look at the settings for this one here, and it's a stitch length of 4 and a density I think of 0.5, and that's what you'd adjusted it to because you thought that it was density that was causing the problem. Density is not part of the issue on this. It's more about underlay and stabilizing the fabric and stitch directions and things pulling tight as they're being stitched. Now, the underlay on this object is an edge run and a tatami, and the stitch length of your tatami is 3.6 and your stitch pacing is 2. Now, I'm going to run it through the player, and what I want you to watch is where the underlay stitching goes down and then where the cover stitching goes on the top. Obviously up here, this is the tatami here, that's the underlay that's going on, and the stitching on the top of the wing is actually going across it this way, and in fact there's no puckering on this section, but here with the curve and where your underlay is still going in the same direction here, but it's also pretty much going in the same direction as the cover stitching, so the underlay becomes part of the problem, not counteracting where the stitches are going. So let's just take a look. It's the edge run, it's the underlay, and this is the cover stitch with the Florentine effect. Okay, so what we need to think about here is that when you framed your fabric in the hoop, you've got the lengthwise grain running north-south, and you have the crosswise grain running east-west, which is the weave of the fabric, and then we've got our underlay stitch which is going on this way, which is stitching across the bias, and then of course on some sections of this we've also got this stitch angle here. Ordinarily your underlay would be running in the opposite direction. And there are similar issues with other pieces, and I'll just pause the video here and load another piece. And this one is the face section, and here again I want you to watch where the underlay goes in and where the stitching goes, and in some of the places the underlay will be supporting the stitches, but in others it won't, and that's because obviously we need to start looking then when we're going to put in our compensation, might we need to put in a manual underlay, and if we did, how would we go about doing that? So I'll activate the player and you can just watch and see how it feels, and you can actually immediately start to spot the areas that you might need to look out for as trouble spots. So this is the underlay going in. Okay, so remember our trouble spot where we'd already got some fabric coming in across the top, running horizontally, and then the stitch angles on the piece that's next to it here have done the same. So this will move back to the centre of the screen in a moment as it comes down the middle. There we go. Now, these long runs running left to right, these are all opportunities where it wants to pull against itself. So as you can see, in some places the direction of the underlay stitching will actually be helping, but in others it will actually be working with the stitches themselves. And sometimes when you're looking at large areas like this, a really good solution is to put down a large area, or even just under particular objects, a man-made or underlay that you've done yourself. And a quick example of that is when I did this design. It's the same one. Mine's done in a different style from yours, but I knew that I was going to be doing this layering effect on it, and as a result I needed to put down an underlay, and that's what I actually want to show you here. I did it on the face and I did it on the body. In fact, actually, if I just click the gold colour here, hide everything else, okay, you can see that was my global underlay, which pretty much covers all the parts where I was going to do the layering and all the other pieces. And the reason why I decided to put this mesh underlay down, whereby I've got one where it's going in this direction and another where it's going in that direction, bearing in mind that the grain of the fabric is going north, south and east, west, I've now given myself a lattice or a framework for my stitches to latch onto. And the decision that I made was my stitches, because I was going for this motif feather-like stitch, which when it goes on it goes up and down. It's pretty much a vertical stitch, and more or less the whole design in some form or another was going to have that same direction of stitch. I had to find a way to be able to hold the fabric underneath it as stable as I possibly could, so that I wouldn't get that contraction issue. And in fact the contraction issue that I would have had would have been a vertical puckering problem. So in other words, it will have been wanting to tighten up on the vertical line here, and so then I would have got my puckering lines going out sideways. So what I did was I put this mesh down to stop that happening. And so let's look at how you can actually make a mesh like this. So first of all, I digitized the shape. So let's go for this here. I'll hide everything else out of the way at the moment. I digitized the shape, and then I went to my settings and I selected a tatami fill. I actually put it that it would be on a density or spacing of 3.5. So that means 3.5 millimeters between this run and that run there. And I left the stitch length at 3.5. But I took off the underlay because that was the direction that I just wanted the stitches to go. The next step that I've done is I've duplicated that shape, which is this one here. I'll unhide this one, hide unselected, and then I've changed the stitch angle on it. So again, it's exactly the same stitches with the spacing and the length, and I don't have an underlay of that. So I have these two objects which sit on top of each other, and then because of where they start and finish, I have a travel line between them so that they don't jump about. And if we put the two of them together, they form this lattice or this mesh, and that becomes my underlay. So although it's two separate objects, it's actually the underlay for everything else that follows. So taking a look at underlays and reading how the stitches actually flow and fill in the pieces that you've digitized can sometimes give you some clues where you're going to hit troubles. Now, a mesh underlay is only one solution. However, it's not essential that you put it on over the whole piece. You can actually just put your own underlay under individual sections, or maybe just crossing part of a section where you know that there's going to be some trouble. Another way that you can go about it is use the underlay that you've got with the piece and then just put another shape in there that just runs a little bit of supporting underlay where it's needed in the other direction, because as you saw, where you'd got some of this Florentine fill, in some of the places the underlay that came with the object that had been digitized worked perfectly well. So that's a couple of fixes that you can have a think about. Now, I'll see you again in part 2 where we'll look at some of the other issues.